Right. Okay. Well, welcome to a discussion about preaching as performance, or the performance of preaching. And I suppose I want to ask the question, first of all, whether it's ever appropriate really to talk about preaching a sermon as a performance. I wonder if anybody's got any comments on that, because I could well imagine that there will be those who say, no, of course preaching can't possibly be a performance, because a performance perhaps implies to some a degree of falseness. So what do you think?
I remember, I forget his name, but the person who plays the vicar in Dad's Army, I heard him give a talk once. In fact, this is a bit of name dropping. I used to sit on the Bishop of Edmonton's Evangelism Advisory Committee, and he was one of the other members.
Oh, wow.
But because he worshipped at a church in Mill Hill. But anyway, the point, I heard him give a talk, and in the question time afterwards, I said, it's sometimes said that a lot of clergy are failed actors. What did he think about this? And he said, I really hope they're not failed actors, because actually Christian word, the Christian story is a drama, and it needs to be performed. And now he was talking about Christian worship as a whole rather than simply about preaching, but the preaching is a key part of that act of worship. And I think seeing it as a drama, there's nothing false about a drama. Drama can tell truths that can be experienced more powerfully than simply when they're kind of stated in a kind of prose format. So I think performance is a really important part of it. And I think we perhaps, when we sort of see it in a negative way, it's because we're thinking of performance precisely as you say, as something kind of false, kind of entertainment in a very kind of narrow, shallow sense. But actually, performance is a really important part of life, and I think preaching as performance connects with that important dimension of life, and it enables us to encounter things that perhaps we don't encounter in ordinary conversation and in other kind of ways.
I think too, you talked about that falsity, or that perception of it being false in performance. But if you think of musicians who perform, what is often commented on is the authenticity. If you think back to even that tired phrase in X Factor and things like that, where you own the room, there's something about a performance that says you connect with the audience, and there's an authenticity of who you are and your message. And I think people will spot the difference if it is a pretend facade performance, or whether this sermon is coming from somewhere deep within you. So one of my tutors always told me never to preach a sermon that hadn't bothered me during the week. In other words, if it hadn't spoken to my soul and moved my heart and challenged my beliefs and behavior, I ought not to be saying anything else to anybody else. But I think that is about the authenticity of the performance, that it comes from a sense of, hey, I have already engaged with God about this, and I want to share this with you.
Yeah, and I think people's concern is, yes, on the one hand with falsity, but also perhaps with using the word performance, people are concerned about whether we're doing things to glorify ourselves rather than God. And so I think that's a really important distinction to bear in mind, because I think if you think about performance, for me, performance is just when you are consciously trying to pay attention to the way that you act or you speak or whatever. It's not entirely spontaneous. And so virtually, I mean, this is a performance now, because the way I'm speaking to you is not the way that I would be speaking to you if I knew it wasn't being recorded, or, you know, if it was just me and Ed in the office or whatever. And I would choose my language differently, and I'd choose sort of how I think about things, and how measured I am in my speech. So to some extent, we perform all the time when we're not alone, whatever situation, when we're always adapting ourselves. So on the one hand, I can't see how a sermon cannot be a performance. But on the other hand, I think there's this important distinction about whose glory is it for. And if I am doing it for my own affirmation and kind of to show off or whatever, that's not great. If I'm just doing it to play to an audience of one, as the Christians in sport have it, and that one is God, that's good. But of course, the reality is our motivations are always mixed, and we're never very pure about these things.
And
Stanley Hauerwas makes a comment about worship being the rehearsal before the performance. In other words, we go out into the world to perform our discipleship, and what we do in worship is rehearsing what we're going to do and who we're going to be. And I think that's helpful for me too, that this is a chance for us not just to perform, but to rehearse what and who we're going to be in the world beyond. And as you say, Rosa, we're always performing. It's what we choose to reveal of ourselves and who we are and of God to the world.
Yeah.
I think I'm conscious that there are occasions when we perhaps more obviously have to perform, and I'm thinking of those occasions when perhaps we are most clearly religious professionals. I don't really like that phrase, but weddings, funerals, you have a role to perform, as it were. And there have been plenty of times when I think in a funeral especially, I've felt overcome by emotion, and yet my role there is not for me to be expressing how I feel, but it's to be helping others in that. So I think in that sense too, there is sometimes a case for us to perform. But just as you were saying, Rosa, there is perhaps a sense in which what performance might be about is using certain skills, certain language, even techniques perhaps, to be able to express most clearly in a particular context what it is you have to communicate. And maybe we might call that rhetoric. I'd be interested to know whether people feel that rhetorical skill is important in preaching. And I mean, I suppose, what would you think of when we say rhetoric or skill?
Well, go on, Stephen, after you. Go on.
Yeah, well, I mean, I am.
Knew another member of Dad's Army, and no, sorry.
I think for me, yes, rhetoric is important. I do just want to begin with my reflection of this with another little story. I went on placement in a church in Oxford, and Debbie came with me for the first Sunday. And when the vicar preached, afterwards, Debbie said, "Oh, I liked his preaching. He just used his ordinary voice, so I kept listening because I thought he might be going to say something important," which perhaps indicates a slightly lower theology of preaching than we might want to aim for. But there was something, so there is something about the ordinariness of speaking that I think can communicate very powerfully and actually be very effective. And actually, really, a message can speak so powerfully beyond the rhetorical skill. I was listening again to Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, and one of the things that struck me actually was that early on in that, it's quite ordinary, actually. I mean, it then becomes much more intense and much more rhetorical, but initially it's quite sort of understated almost. But it's just the power of the person and the message which just comes through so powerfully and so strongly. So I don't want to overstate rhetoric, but I think in terms of, if you've got a key message to get across, then to have carefully crafted words that help to get that message across, that help it to sink into people's hearts and minds, and indeed, of course, into your own heart and mind. I think the careful use of words, I mean, simple things like I will often kind of say the same thing 3 times in just using slightly different words, because certainly for me, I have a very special devotion to Our Lady of the Wandering Thought when I'm listening to sermons, and my mind will go off all sorts of places. And if someone only says something important once, is gone, and I've missed that. So you need to reinforce things, and also our language doesn't necessarily communicate instantly. So to say something once, to affirm it in slightly different language, and then again in different language. Well, if someone hasn't quite got it the first time or the second time, then by the third time they've got the point. And I think that that's one part of what's important for rhetoric for me. I think the other point, which does link a little bit back to performance, is that it's a question of whether you think of preaching as trying to convey ideas, or actually as trying to kind of shape people. And I think sermons don't always influence simply by giving people things that they can remember in their intellect. It's actually kind of speaking to the whole person, and I think rhetoric is part of that art of speaking to the whole person. It's using words to connect, because words are powerful. Words and words can touch and communicate. I mean, it's interesting actually. We're sort of conscious in these current times of the absence of the physical contact, but of course with our words and with our sight, this is physical contact. Yes, okay, it's mediated digitally, but still, words are coming out of my mouth and words are going into your ears. So there is that kind of connection, that physical connection, and I think rhetoric and the careful use of those words helps to accentuate the physicality, if you like, of preaching.
Mm-hmm. Rosa?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it depends what you mean by rhetoric, because rhetoric used to be 1/3 of the university syllabus, and it's used to cover many of the things that we would include in essay writing. So it would include things like collecting your arguments and structuring them and so on. And memory was a really key part of it. Well, not just memorizing your speech, but also just in your general life, memorizing lots of examples and stories that you could improvise when you were preaching. But I think we'll probably talk about delivery here, which would be kind of the fifth aspect of rhetoric. And when I was thinking about this, I came across a really good quote from Quintilian. Can I read it to you? It's only 4 lines long. It says, "The head, being the chief member of the body, has a corresponding importance in delivery, serving not merely to produce graceful effect, but to illustrate our meaning as well. To secure grace, it is essential that the head should be carried naturally and erect, for a droop suggests humility, while if it be thrown back, it seems to express arrogance. If inclined to one side, it gives an impression of languor, while if it's held too stiffly and rigidly, it appears to indicate a rude and savage temper." So there we go.
I'm feeling extremely self-conscious now.
Absolutely.
How I'm holding my head.
But I do think that isn't that an important point, that whether he's right or not, that we do interpret from how a person is communicating, and sometimes we think as preachers we're not communicating. All we're doing is we're saying some words. Of course, as we know, body language, way in which we communicate those words, all of that is communicating, perhaps even more so than the words themselves. I mean, Craig, you're somebody, I think, who in your preaching, I would see you as a fairly rhetorical preacher. Do you see that yourself? I know you put a lot of effort into sort of crafting how you produce the words for a sermon.
Yes. So it's interesting thinking about the Martin Luther King famous sermon speech. That wasn't the first time that many of the rhetorical devices that Luther King used at that point had been used. He'd used those in sermons previously. They were part of that fourth part of the classical understanding of rhetoric. That was part of his memory. That was part of stories and phrases that he knew would resonate and that he could deploy. In effect, he could riff off them and improvise off them. And if you listen to the final parts of that speech, there are different emphasis. He repeats the same phrase, but puts different emphasis on different words. And it's back to Stephen's thing of saying the same thing over and over again. And I think, yeah, I've tried to craft So when I was ordained, the man who preached at my sermon, at my service, said to me, as you go into ministry, you're called to love three things. You're called to love God, you're called to love people, and you're called to love words. And that came from someone who I regard as a craftsman of public speaking and preaching. And I think I've always tried to do that quite seriously and thought, okay, what are the phrases that will stick in someone's mind? I often, nearly always, give my sermon a title. I often try, and it's back to this classic view of rhetoric. The second part of the classical view is the same as you said, Rosa, about writing an essay. It's about arranging our argument. How do we construct it? So quite often I will go to the start of the sermon and the end of the sermon and say, how do these things reinforce the core message that I wanted people to take away? And again, it's perhaps where I grew up. It was about, or it seemed to be much more about imparting information. So you got 3 points that all began with the same letter, and it was about so that you could learn that particular piece of doctrine. It wasn't as much preaching for response. And as you listen to some of the black preachers, as you listen to some much more evangelistic mission type preaching, it's about saying, what is your response to this? And so I often think, what now? What are people left with? There may be a phrase that says, what is going to wind its way into my head and my heart over the next week, where suddenly in a situation that phrase will come back? And I think, without it becoming pretentious or without it becoming necessarily something poetic, trying to find the turns of phrases that will allow people to then have that in their memory. I think that's important. And one of the ways we do that is in that last classical sense about how we deliver the speech. Classically, people didn't use notes, so they memorized, internalized what they were going to say, and they practiced how that would be delivered. And sometimes that would be the body language. But interestingly, I've just come from recording a service on the BBC, where on the radio, where there are no, but I do the body language because I can't do it without the body language. But nobody's going to see it. But what's important is how your voice is performed, and that changes depending on the audience. So for different programs, I will have a different voice, and this kind of comes back to the performance thing.
Can you give us an example?
Well, today, the person who had produced the script wasn't going to be there when we were doing the recording, and they had just put at the top of the script the word "cooch," because they know that if I get strident and if I start to preach as if I were in an auditorium in a congregation of 500 people, my voice then becomes very different to what it needs to be on a one-to-one on the radio, and that needs to be much more intimate. So I have to remember that when I'm doing it on the radio, it needs to be that intimate me rather than the more strident kind of me. And I think that the best example of this is years ago when I did recordings for the Beeb. I did sometimes Radio 2 late night thought for the days and Radio 4 early morning thought for the days. And there is a different voice that you need to capture a Radio 2 audience on a working shift at 2 a.m. in the morning compared to people waking up on a Radio 4 audience. And so it is about not about a lack of authenticity, but about saying, how do I employ the skill of my voice and my delivery to best enable that message to be delivered?
And I think this is an important practical point, really, that we wouldn't necessarily use the same style in a different setting. So for myself, I know that I'm a better preacher to a large congregation than to a small congregation. And in the large congregation context, I naturally use a rhetorical approach in the sense of I will use rhythm in language, I'll use alliteration, these sorts of techniques. there's a church I go to and preach on maybe once a year, twice a year or so, and there are usually about 10 people in the congregation. I find that really difficult because those kind of rhetorical things, they just don't work. You need a much more intimate, much more kind of conversational approach. And so I wonder, what are some of the things that you will adjust for different situations? Do you have any reflections on that? What might make you change, I suppose, your approach?
I think congregational size is one of the very obvious ones. Most of us, when we preach, we might not get Pentecostal amens every 2 minutes from the pews, but we are looking for some sense of feedback, some sense of engagement. And that is different in an intimate of 10, 15, 20 people than it is to 200 or 300 or more. So I think sermon, the size of the congregation is the easiest and most straightforward one to think. Other things might affect it too. What has happened before it may affect it. So one of the interesting things in worship is, how does the worship before and after enable the sermon to sit and find a place? What builds up? And we've been in places, or I've certainly had experiences where I thought, wow, this is an awesome time of worship. I'm so glad to be starting to preach now. And there've been other occasions when I thought, this has felt really low and like walking through treacle. How am I going to lift this? So I think that has an impact too, as will what has happened in the congregation that day. So if you have heard on the door of something that has happened, and it is maybe bad news or it is incredibly good news, that may then affect how the congregation are, how they're feeling, and how you're feeling, and how you then pitch the response. So I remember once a much loved deacon in our church had died on the Saturday night, but most people hadn't heard that news. And so in making that announcement at the very beginning of the service, it affected the whole service, and it affected the way then you had to then think, well, actually my tone now needs to be more pastoral than maybe it was prepared to be more challenging. And maybe you adapt your sermon as well as the delivery, you adapt the words in the midst of that because of the context.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, can I ask you, you're used to preaching in lots of different places. To what extent, obviously you will write a sermon that is aimed at a particular setting, but to what extent do you also think about your own delivery and how that might change according to where you are? And just to come back to that performance bit, and sorry if this is too complicated a question, but to what extent are you, on the one hand, trying to be you, and on the other hand, trying to adjust who you are for the congregation to understand what you're trying to say, or to receive what you're trying to say?
Yes, there's quite a lot in there.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Any reflections on that stream of speech that I
consciousness? Yes, I try to avoid preaching a stream of consciousness, I think is the
Well, I must confess, when you said earlier about you were a follower of Our Lady of the Wandering Thought, I thought at first you were referring to your preaching style.
Oh, thank you. Yes, yes. I mean, part of that question was about being you, and sort of and connecting with the congregation, and I do think that's really important, because I think preaching, however much it is a divine act, it is a human act, and in a sense, all God's speech comes through into human life and through human life and the human world, in a sense. In some sense, we could discuss that bit, but certainly preaching, the human vehicle of the preaching of God's word through preaching, is not merely incidental. And I think preaching is also a corporate act. It's not something which one individual does. In fact, I'm thinking here. I'd not thought about this before, but since you're also sort of connecting back to the performance question, a book which has been quite influential for me is a book called Musicking by someone called Christopher Small, who is challenging the whole kind of notion in music of the piece of music as a product, and is wanting to see music much more as an event in which everyone is a participant, from the people who hand out the programs if it's that kind of concert, or serve behind the bar if it's that kind of concert, to the performance and the audience and everyone. And I wonder whether we should see preaching in that kind of way, as well. Yes, and I'm fairly sure we should, as an event in which everyone is involved. And in order for that to happen, there has to be a connection. You have to establish a connection. Now, if you're preaching in the same place regularly, that connection is already there, and you don't have to work too hard to establish it. But just to give you an example, I was preaching in Tabernacle in Penarth recently, and I thought, I've never been here before. I don't know the congregation. I knew a couple of people there, but I thought I needed to establish some sort of rapport with the congregation. So I talked about the fact that on the previous Friday evening, I'd been playing a gig in a pub in Penarth, and so but between the Albions and Friday night and Tabernacle on Sunday morning, I was seeing a pretty good range of Penarth life, and then sort of use that as a way into the sermon. So it was just kind of telling them something about me, so that they can then connect with who I am. So I'm not just a kind of a person without a life, but I'm someone that they know something about, other than the fact that I'm a lecturer at the South Wales Baptist College and I'm here to preach, kind of thing. So I think it's about establishing that human connection, which is of course what God does in Christ in the incarnation. So if preaching is rooted in that, in God's mode of communication, then it's about finding those points of connection. And I do, I've sometimes got it wrong. I was invited to preach once at St Mary's Church in Islington, which is on Upper Street, right in the heart of trendy Tony Blair kind of land, that kind of Islington context. And in fact, I was asked to speak specifically about theology and jazz. So I thought, okay, so this is Islington trendy kind of context, and I prepared the sermon on that basis. I can't remember what it was now, what I was saying, but and I looked out at the congregation and I thought, this is a completely different congregation somehow than I had imagined, and so I didn't get the connection right somehow there. So there's a risk, but I think you have to. I think attempts at communication are always a risk.
And I forget who was it we had recently was saying it was Rob Beamish last month saying that not every sermon will go perfectly, and we should be okay with that. Rosa, Stephen was just picking up this sense of connection and making a personal connection with the congregation. And I wonder if that's something that has changed in preaching over the years, because certainly when I was starting out, I remember some people saying, the preacher should never bring themselves into the pulpit. What do you think about that? Do you share sort of personal anecdotes from your own life in preaching? Does that seem an appropriate thing to do?
Yes, I do. And I think this is just a personal theory, which I don't know, whether it's been sort of tested more widely, but it seems to me that quite often preachers move on, ministers move churches after about 5 years. This seems to be quite a normal sort of length of time for people to stay in a pastorate. And the reason I mention it is because after I'd been in my church 5 years, I suddenly noticed that I could no longer avoid them sort of knowing me very well. And so I think sort of after a few years, you get to the point where you have to decide, am I actually going to live among these people as one of this community and on equal terms, on an equal footing, or am I going to somehow try and maintain that sort of distance that is there when you're new and people kind of treat you with a bit of extra reverence and respect because you're the new minister and all that? Or should I just move to another church so I can start again and maintain that distance? Now, I'm not in any way saying that this is why people move churches, but it did strike me after 5 years that things were different. And so now I would say that my church knows me very well, and it just changes the way you preach because you're preaching out of a position of being part of that community on an equal footing. And also, of course, things have happened during the 7 years or 8 years that I've been there, which included one of our family being very ill. And again, every time things like that happen, if you have some sort of family crisis, I think you have to decide whether you're going to share that with your congregation or whether you're going to keep it separate. And that affects then the way that you preach. So I've gone down the route of sharing it. I don't know whether everybody would agree with that, but yeah.
Hang on, Craig. Sorry, I just want to move us on because we're running out of time. In terms of learning to be a better preacher, I think for me, what's made a difference is listening to other preachers and seeing who resonates with me and who doesn't, and to some extent trying to imitate the good examples that I've heard. I would say also early on as a preacher, I would preach a sermon beforehand so that my poor wife would therefore have to hear it twice. But it sort of helped me to gain some confidence in the words that I was going to say before I actually then stood up and said it. But also listening back to recordings afterwards. In those days, it would have been on cassette. And I know it's painful and people don't like doing it, but it's helpful because it just you don't notice what the things are you say. For me as a preacher, when I started out, I had no idea that I would go every time I breathed in, I would go, and it was really irritating because especially if you've got a microphone, it would make a loud noise. But I only realized that by listening back. So I think those are some good things to do to help a person preach. But what would be, if I may put you on the spot, what would be your 2 top tips to help people better communicate in their sermons? Any of you?
I mean, I've been thinking about this, and I just remember what John Weaver said when I was a student. He tried to get us all to say what we thought was the most important quality a preacher had to have. And we all guessed various things, but none of us guessed what was in his mind. And what he wanted us to say was compassion. And it was something to do with understanding where your congregation is and what they're struggling with and preaching from that perspective. And I just found that an incredibly helpful thing to say, something I've tried to keep in mind. So my top tip would be to have compassion on your congregation.
Actually, and maybe therefore preach for not such a long time. Yeah. Stephen,
that reminds me of something I used to do very, very early on when I was first preaching. On the top of all my notes, I would write, love God, love the people. And that's that kind of a double love as a kind of at the heart of what I was trying to do in preaching. I think the other thing I would say is try different approaches. I mean, over the years I've sort of oscillated between using full notes, writing out the whole sermon, and then using more bullet point type of notes with literally just a few headings. And I have to say that I mean, I'm much less, if I'm going somewhere kind of completely new, and if it's a larger congregation, then I don't have the confidence, I have to confess, to do just the bullet points. But sometimes going to a smaller a smaller church, a smaller congregation, I will feel more able to do that, and I think that is perhaps also useful for taking those opportunities to develop perhaps a more informal conversational type of style that may then also kind of influence larger scale preaching also. So try different things.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Craig?
I think you asked for two. I've got three, but one that I was going to say earlier. One of the things about this is about, if I'm going to use my family, ask permission, because they are going to be sitting in the church and they don't want to be embarrassed by the story that you thought was funny around the dinner table last night. And also, just in terms of that, if we're talking about ourselves, just ask, is it actually true about ourselves? Because I have heard many preachers preach about something that happened to them, and coincidentally it had happened to many other sermon deliverers that same week, because they'd all been reading the same notes or the same book. So just be authentic about what has actually happened. I think there is no better way to learn about your delivery than to listen or to watch back what you've done. If you have video recordings, great, but most people will just listen. But listen back to what you've done, and you will hear the things that work and the things that don't, and then you just have to work at them. And I guess the thing for me there was listening to other preachers, and again, without not being inauthentic and seeking to mimic them, but seeking to learn from them and say, what is the thing that appeals to me, that works in those sermons. So I think all of those things are important, but particularly and if you've got a critical friend or two in the congregation, it may be your partner, but it may be somebody else who's able to say, probably not on the Sunday, let's leave it till the Wednesday, but is able to say, what worked well for me this week was when you said this, and where I lost it was here. So and one of the things that's really worked for me in that is having had the chance to work with people in the BBC where they have critiqued it long before it's ever got to the delivery stage, and they talk about exit points, where people go off and worship Our Lady of the Wandering Thought, because you've asked a question and allowed them the freedom to go a wandering. And so learning things like that and hearing them, having somebody critically look at it and say, I know that's a wonderfully poetic phrase and you've probably worked really hard at it, but it doesn't work. It's just you got to be brutal in the editing for that. So I think that has been important. Anyone who will listen and give feedback.
And that's a really helpful point. And it's worth, I guess, just spiritualizing that for a moment to say that God may have something different in mind for your sermon than you do. And yes. So the person who goes away and says at the door, I was really struck when you said this, and you think, oh, I never said that. That's okay.
Absolutely.
My 2 points, I think, and of course, with all of these things, people will have their own styles. So when people look at the different video clips we've and sermons online that I sent out last night, they will see that there is such a range, and we don't have to adopt any particular one style. It's not that one is right and others are wrong. But I still think there is value in varying pace, position, pitch, and body language. So when you're sitting, listening and watching a sermon, that variation, this is very important in giving people cues as to when do they need to prick up their ears, when is it a long explanation that maybe they don't need to take particular notice to. So do think about that and try and make that natural. But I think my big point is preach it as if it matters. And if it doesn't matter, don't preach it. I feel moved by my preaching, and I don't mean because my preaching's good, but because I want to try to preach something that has moved me. And if it's moved me, then I hope that it might help to move others. So I think that would be my one. Preach it as if it matters. Final question. I've been really grateful for this conversation, and I think, goodness me, how fortunate we are to have such talented folks as yourselves, and incredible that South Wales Baptist College, that Craig and Rosa are going to be leading the nation in worship on Sunday, in both Welsh and English on the BBC. So thank you for that, and we'll be praying for you for that. But today, as we record this, it's April Fool's Day. And I just wonder, do you think that has any relevance to a conversation about preaching?
I think it does. So I'm minded to think of Shakespeare's King Lear, where the fool gets to say all sorts of things, all sorts of critiques of the king, and it's a tradition of the fool in the monarchy that the fool gets to speak truth to power, and that in itself becomes a prophetic action, where whether it's the prophet speaking to David and saying, "You are the man who has stolen this one sheep," or whatever it might be. That opportunity to speak prophetically allows us to be a fool for Jesus in that way. Someone who can step outside and point out what is wrong. So speaking truth to power in that sense is a fool's privilege.
Do either of the other, Stephen or Rosa, do either of you have any thoughts on this?
I thought you were going to say either of the other two fools. I think it's helpful I do think of myself as a kind of fool in the sense that, I mean, who am I to talk about these things? Who am I to stand in the pulpit and tell people stuff about God? I'm nobody, and so there is something very scary and very humbling about that. And so that's one side of it. And the other side of it is actually not really caring what people think and just saying, well, I'm just going to do my best for God. And if I mess up, I mess up. And, there we go. Like you say, he can do stuff with it. So,
yeah.
I think for me, in a sense, it's the other side of the point about rhetoric, that actually God can speak perfectly well and sometimes better through our flawed attempts, and the foolishness of our attempts to speak about God. I think may often communicate. I mean, I was thinking about this. I was thinking that there's a Van Morrison song about the village idiot. He knows something, but he's just not saying. That sort of, that whole notion of the wise folly, which I think is very powerful. And I think sometimes maybe it's the use of humor in sermons is an interesting question, but sometimes good humor used well can actually communicate something very powerful. Sometimes it might be just a joke at the beginning that's part of establishing that rapport, but sometimes humor, I mean, if you think about stand-up comedy, actually can speak very, 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 very powerfully and insightfully into the situations that we are experiencing. So I guess there's something about that there also that's worth noting.
I was thinking of Jesus talking about camels going through eyes of needles and things. I mean, what a foolish image, and yet what power that has had over the years. And maybe the last point is, I just want to say, perhaps April Fool's Day reminds us not to take ourselves too seriously, and that's a valuable thing in the pulpit as well.
And there is too the sense that the whole gospel has always been foolish to the wise.
Yeah.
Yes.
Foolish.
Yes.
It doesn't make sense, and it's not supposed to give you rational answers. It's supposed to take you on an adventure into this drama of foolishness for God.
Yes.
Fantastic. That's a wonderful place to end.